returned from his work overseas. His reappearance in Rosehill had been the subject of much speculation. There were whispers of some ill-fated romance, of financial difficulties, and of quarrels with his uncle. Miss Marple, observing quietly, noted the slight tension in his jaw, the restless shifting of his hands. Elsewhere, the vicar's wife was urging visitors to admire the tapestry cushions contributed by Miss Lydia Vane, a newcomer to the village whose presence had in a few short months awakened more gossip than a dozen baptisms or funerals. Miss Vane was undeniably striking, fair-haired, graceful, with a quiet poise that some interpreted as charm, and others as hauteur. "Too beautiful, if you ask me," murmured Mrs. Bartlett, the grocer's wife, to her neighbour, "and too fond of glancing in mirrors." "She's a lady, that's plain enough," returned the neighbour, "but one never knows where ladies come from these days." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, heard without appearing to hear. A faint smile touched her lips. She had long since learned that mirrors, both literal and metaphorical, often revealed more than their owners intended. At 3 o'clock precisely the raffle was announced, and a small crowd pressed eagerly about the table. The prizes were displayed with suitable pride: a hamper of delicacies, a cut glass decanter, a set of silver spoons, and, most admired of all, a large ornate mirror framed in carved oak, said to have belonged to an old manor house now demolished. Its polished surface caught the light, reflecting the eager faces gathered before it. "A handsome piece," remarked Colonel Arbuthnot, the retired army officer who lived at Willow House. "Wouldn't mind winning that myself." "Far too big for my cottage," tittered Miss Green, the postmistress. The vicar, smiling benignly, drew the first ticket. There was a small cheer as Mrs. Bartlett won the decanter. The second prize went to a young maid in service at Marleycombe Hall, who received the silver spoons with astonished delight. Then came the third drawing, and it was Miss Lydia Vane whose ticket was called. She stepped forward with a serene smile, her pale hands resting briefly on the carved oak frame. For a moment the sunlight fell full upon her face, reflected in the mirror with startling clarity. A murmur ran through the crowd, half admiration, half something less easily defined. It was at that instant that a small commotion arose near the tea-tent. A cry rang out, shocked, high-pitched, and the villagers turned as one. Dr. Denham was kneeling beside a man collapsed upon the grass. His face was pale, his body motionless. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring anxiously. "It's Mr. Peterstone, the solicitor," someone whispered. Dr. Denham raised his head, his expression grave. "Stand back, please. He has had some kind of seizure." The laughter, the cheerful hum of voices, the rustling of skirts, all fell away into a hush broken only by the rustle of leaves overhead. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, setting aside her teacup with careful precision. Her eyes, clear and perceptive, fixed not upon the stricken man, but upon the startled, shifting expressions of those gathered around him. For it was not the collapse itself that struck her most forcibly, but the reactions it provoked, and in particular the fleeting look that crossed the face of one person present. A look not of shock, nor of sympathy, but of something far more dangerous. And though no one yet knew it, the mirror that gleamed so innocently in the afternoon sun had already begun to keep its secret. Chapter 2. Whispers over tea by 6 o'clock. The clouds had blown in from the downs, and the fete, once so blithe, broke apart like a flock of birds in a sudden gust. The bunting sagged, the music stopped, and the tables were stripped in a flurry of anxious hands. In the lane beyond the vicarage wall, bicycles rattled away toward kitchens where kettles hissed, and people with voices lowered in the proper key of concern began to rehearse what they had seen and what they had not. Mr. Peterstone had been carried into the vicarage study by the stronger men, Colonel Arbuthnot and young Mr. Simmons from the dairy being among them, while Dr. Denham did what he could. The vicar's wife hovered with towels and smelling salts, which were applied to no one, and the vicar himself telephoned the police with a hand that shook despite the steadiness of his voice. It was later said, and often, that he had been gone before his body was lifted from the grass, that his face had that particular stillness not to be mistaken, that there had been a faint, unpleasant odor. Almonds, some insisted, though others indignantly refuted the fancifulness of it. But in the very moment it occurred, one felt only the indecency of a man dying at a garden fete, beside the sponge cake and the raffle books. Miss Marple, walking home with Mrs. Bartlett along the hedge-lined lane, added a soft murmur now and then to the other woman's eager stream. She never contradicted, she never urged. She let Mrs. Bartlett talk, as a fisherman lets the line play out, noting what tugged and where it snagged. I said to Mr. Bartlett as we were crossing the green, "It's never heart with that one, not with a stride like he has. A proper straight-backed man, Mr. Peterstone, and careful as a hen with ducklings, so it's either too much tobacco, which you can smell a mile off, or a shock to the system. Not that I know of any shock. Do you?" Miss Marple, whose step was daintier than brisk, shook her head. "I could not say. He seemed orderly." "That's it exactly," Mrs. Bartlett agreed, pleased to be echoed. "Orderly. All neat and tidy with his accounts. Very proper with widows, which some are not. If there's one man in Rosehill who would not fall down dead at a fete, it's Mr. Peterstone. Unless—" Here she paused, alight with the deliciousness of the forbidden word. "Unless poisoned." "My dear," said Miss Marple mildly, "we must not run ahead of ourselves." "Of course not," said Mrs. Bartlett, and did exactly that for the next quarter mile, enumerating the various means by which a person might be dispatched at a garden party. She knew, it seemed, of a cousin's aunt who had succumbed to something deadly distilled from foxglove leaves. Only fancy, Miss Marple, from a garden. And a second cousin, reputedly, who had once been given too much of a certain tonic, and had never been quite right afterwards. At the wicket gate to Miss Marple's cottage, Mrs. Bartlett, rather out of breath from so much hazardous speculation, lowered her voice. "They say, you know, that Mr. Peterstone kept papers, very secret papers, that sort of thing. Wills and deeds and such can unsettle people." "They can," said Miss Marple, and thought of the small, dry way the solicitor's fingers had moved when she had seen him turn pages in church, like a man accustomed to making no sound where others might. "But more often, I think, it is not paper that unsettles so much as pride, or jealousy, or shame." Mrs. Bartlett blinked, impressed and slightly thwarted by the observation. "Well, dear, I shall bring round a little stew later. One must keep up one's strength." When Miss Marple let herself into her cottage, she moved at once, with that accustomed neatness of habit, to light the lamp on the round table by the window. The room took on its evening coziness, a little glow upon the faded chintz, a familiar orderliness to the bookshelf with its sensible titles, the ticking of the clock above the hearth. She took off her gloves, laid them precisely in their dish, and sat, hands folded. What she saw when she closed her eyes was not, oddly, Mr. Peterstone, nor the huddled circle about him, but the raffle table and the gleaming surface of the oak-framed mirror. She saw the expression, so swift one might have thought it imagined, flit over a face when Lydia Vane's number was called. Not admiration, not envy exactly, but a kind of alarm that seemed wholly out of keeping with the prize and the occasion. A mirror may keep a secret, thought Miss Marple, but it also reflects. Outside, the village settled into the particular hush of a summer evening, the distant thud of a door, a child called in, the creak and then the steady roll of the milk lorry as it passed on its rounds toward Marleycombe Hall. Presently there came a quiet footstep on the path and a firm knock. "Do forgive me," said Dr. Denham when she opened the door. He stood bareheaded, looking graver and, Miss Marple thought, older than he had at the fete. "I thought you would wish to know. There is nothing to be done. He is gone." "I am sorry," said Miss Marple, and the sympathy in her voice was simple and true. "You must have had a trying afternoon." Denham gave a brief, impatient movement of the shoulders. "It is the manner of it. Sudden. One has seen strokes, of course. Hearts. But this seemed not quite that." "Ah," said Miss Marple, and waited. "There is a smell," he said, lowering his voice as though confessing to an impropriety. "One sometimes associates. Well, you know the stories everyone reads. I should not like to name it. There is no certainty in these things without tests." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "And the police?" "I have telephoned the county. Inspector Lake is on his way. He is a capable fellow, I think." A faint smile, weary but genuine, touched the doctor's mouth. "And now I must face my wife. She is very properly indignant on behalf of Rosehill." "Mrs. Denham is a tower," said Miss Marple. "But even towers may tremble." After he had gone, Miss Marple stood a moment longer at the door, looking out at the pale strip of sky over the hedge. She thought of Mr. Peterstone's thin, well-tended face, and of the particular sort of dignity that attaches to a man who keeps other people's secrets for a living. Then she closed the door softly and made herself a cup of cocoa. It is unusual, as she would have said, to think clearly on an empty stomach. Gossip in Rosehill, as in all villages, obeyed its own swift geometries. By 8 o'clock it had reached the post office, whence it would be dispersed on the morrow with the letters. By 1:15 it had threaded itself through the cottages along Sparrow Lane and insinuated itself into the kitchen at Willow House, where Colonel Arbuthnot was told by his housekeeper that he had been in the very nick of it, to fetch the blankets. At Marleycombe Hall, Lady Phoebe Winterton, a woman much afflicted by ill fortune and devoted entirely to roses and to the memory of the late Sir Julian, received the news with a dazed "Oh," then asked with touching irrelevance whether the winner of the mirror had been a person known to be careful with furniture. "She will do very well with it, I am sure." Miss Green, the postmistress, told 2 customers and a cat, none of whom were strictly in need of the information. "Very elegant in her ways, Miss Fane, though I had not imagined her to care for old things. More modern, I'd have said." "Modern, indeed," sniffed Mrs. Simmons, whose ideas of modernity were as vague as they were deploring. "Too modern for some. And that nephew of the doctor's, did you see how he looked? White as chalk one minute and red as a beet the next. Mark my words, there's trouble there." At the Denhams, trouble had arrived already in the form of Mr. Robert Denham, who stood in the drawing-room with his back to the mantel, hands shoved deep into his pockets, while his aunt arranged and rearranged a bowl of peonies with restless precision. "Really, Robert," she said, "one does not glare at people at a fete." "I was not glaring," returned Robert, though he had in fact done just that. "I was looking at Miss Vane," said Mrs. Denham sharply, "which is not at all the same thing." He said nothing. His eyes, fine eyes Miss Marple had once observed, though ill at ease within their owner, had that stubborn, wounded look of a man compelled to look inwards when he would rather look away. Dr. Denham came in, his tie at a discouraged angle, and remarked, "There will be an inquest." He spoke with the dry finality of a man who has put away his instruments after a futile operation. "We had best prepare for callers." "I shall prepare for callers," said Mrs. Denham, both indignant and competent. "And I shall prepare the village, if it comes to that. There has been an outrage. To die like that in the middle of things." She stopped as her husband's eyebrow rose and amended, "Poor man. Poor, poor man." Robert's gaze moved to the window. "He spoke to me this morning," he said, as if to himself. "In the lane. He asked me whether I was finding Rosehill amusing." "Impertinent," said his aunt. "Solicitors always are." "He said," Robert went on, "that I must make friends quickly here. People are quick to decide," he said. Then he smiled. He had a rather dry little smile, like a man tasting a grape. "The trick is to decide first about them." "Perhaps he had decided about someone and was mistaken," said Dr. Denham. "In any case, Lake will want us not to embroider." "Lake?" Robert turned. "The inspector." "Oh," said Robert, and pushed his hands deeper into his pockets. Inspector Lake arrived from the county just after 9. A tall, neat man with a careful manner, and a teacher's way of pausing to ensure his question had been properly heard. He took statements in the vicarage study while the vicar, looking miserable and apologetic, offered tea to everyone as if tea could undo a death if only given in the correct quantity. Miss Marple was fetched in her turn, and came without fuss, small and composed, her hat held properly in her lap as she waited in the hard chair opposite the inspector's. Lake had already acquired a notebook fat with names and times. His pencil, like his expression, was reserved. "You were present, Miss Marple, when Mr. Peterstone collapsed." "Yes." "Where were you sitting?" "Under the chestnut tree, a very pleasant place. It allowed one a view of most proceedings without being in anyone's way." Lake's mouth twitched. He liked precision. "You saw the raffle?" "Yes." "You noticed nothing unusual? No argument, no quarrel?" "No quarrel. People were amiable, though a little excited. There is always a certain amount of agitation over prizes." "The mirror?" "That was the chief attraction, I think." He looked up, considering her. "Did you purchase a ticket?" "2. I won nothing. It is often so. I do not repine." He coughed to hide the smallest laugh. "Did you happen to see Mr. Peterstone before he fell?" "I had not looked at him directly, but one notices groupings." She folded her hands more tightly, demurring at her own words. "He was alone. That in itself can be a kind of grouping, if you understand me." "I think I do," said Lake, who perhaps did not, but who had a sensible instinct for listening when something in a quiet voice suggested value. "Had he taken anything? Tea? A cake?" "There was a cup near him. Whether it was his I cannot say." "Thank you." He hesitated, his pencil lifted. "If anything else occurs to you, please send word." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." When she rose, the inspector stood too, and by that small courtesy recommended himself to her. There is a sort of policeman, she thought, who regards the elderly as an impediment. There is another sort who has known grandmothers. Inspector Lake, she suspected, belonged to the latter. In the hall she encountered Lydia Vane, who had just concluded her own interview and stood with one gloved hand upon the new mirror's frame. Someone, perhaps the vicar's wife in her bustle, had set the prize against the wall in order to sweep the study. Lydia's profile in the dim corridor light might have belonged to one of those cool English portraits that capture neither warmth nor coldness, only a fine reserve. "How dreadful," Lydia said, not moving. "How perfectly dreadful." "The worst things," said Miss Marple, "often happen in the best clothes." Lydia's lips curved, too quickly for amusement. "You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. One grows old and so avoids being quoted," Miss Marple replied. "The young cannot bear it." Lydia's eyes, very clear grey eyes, shifted quite involuntarily toward the glass. It returned her gaze with that faithful exactness which is both the virtue and the limitation of mirrors. For a heartbeat her composure altered. Fear? No, not fear. Calculation, perhaps, and something like fatigue. "You like your prize?" Miss Marple asked, with a gentle nod. "It is handsome," Lydia said, as though the word came from a colder room than the one they stood in. "Quite a conversation piece." "Conversation can be a great comfort," said Miss Marple, "and an inconvenience." Lydia withdrew her hand. "I am staying with Mrs. Redpath, as you know. She will be delighted with the effect in the drawing-room." Miss Marple made a small, neutral sound. Mrs. Redpath was a widow of means and little imagination. She liked objects to be tall and shiny. She liked people to be quiet and grateful. It was not a comfortable house for a girl with a quick mind and no history she cared to recite. They parted with properly expressed regrets. As Miss Marple stepped out into the night, she reflected that Lydia Vane had not once asked the practical questions a shocked person might ask. When? How? Was there pain? Instead, Lydia had held herself near the mirror, as one might stand near a friend one did not trust enough to turn her back upon. The following morning was Sunday, and the church, though no one would have put it so plainly, was fuller than usual. Grief, curiosity, and the English habit of doing as one ought combined to produce a congregation acute in its attention, and generous in its silences. The vicar preached on the parable of the wheat and the tares, which may have been tactless, but his voice faltered only once. Miss Marple, in her accustomed view, counted hats. She did not count in numbers, but in impressions. the forward, the drooping, the tilted with defiance, the restrained. She saw Robert Denham, too upright by half, kneeling with his face in his hands, and Mrs. Denham with an expression carefully arranged for public view. She saw Colonel Arbuthnot scowl at the hymn as though it had done him a wrong, and Miss Green mouthing the words in zeal beyond tunefulness. Of Lydia Vane there was at first no sign. Then, as the second hymn began, she slipped in at the back with Mrs. Redpath. Late, which is often a message. She wore pale blue and looked at no one. When the service ended, she vanished equally quickly, like a note folded and passed along the pew and out the door. In the churchyard, words tiptoed and then ran. There was talk of an inquest on Tuesday, of Inspector Lake's interest in the tea tent, of a cup sent away, wrapped up like a parcel at Christmas. Mrs. Bartlett, struggling between the piety of sorrow and the itch for particulars, confided to Miss Marple that she had heard the doctor tell the inspector something about testing and toxins, and that in her cousin's village, not far from St. Mary Mead, a man had once perished after taking a draught known locally as shepherd's cordial, which was composed of goodness knew what. "People will drink cordials," said Miss Marple, and thought of younger days and old women's cupboards, and the innocent poisons that hide in hedgerows like shy children. Inspector Lake, a discreet presence by the lich gate, raised his hat to her as she passed. He had the air of a man busy knitting a pattern from threads of different colors, not yet clear, but promising to be something if only enough threads could be found. At home again, Miss Marple took out her duster and attended to the small rituals of a Sunday afternoon. She dusted the mantel, turned the antimacassar, set the hyacinth pot an inch to the left, discarded that decision, and returned it to precisely where it had been. Then she sat down and made herself, not notes, for she seldom wrote down the things that mattered, but a little list in her head, the sort one might teach a child to recite before bed. Things noted. Mr. Peterstone's aloneness at a communal moment. The cup. Near him. Not yet his, perhaps. Lydia Vane's glance. At the mirror, and something like weariness behind it. Robert Denham's altered color and insistence upon looking. The smell the doctor would not name. The mirror itself, object of desire, yes, but also a surface upon which other people's faces float like fish at the top of a pool. She added after a pause, a seventh item, silences. Who had not said what they would naturally have said? Who had failed to ask? In a village, the missing question was often more telling than any answer. She had almost decided upon a small piece of lace mending, comforting in its logic, when there came a brisk knock at the door, and without waiting for the invitation she had not yet given, Mrs. Denham swept in with the air of a naval launch making harbor. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "you will forgive me. The inspector has been to see us again. He is very thorough, I'm sure, but I do not like to think he is wandering about the village making people uneasy. I have told him as much. One must manage these things, you know." "Certainly," said Miss Marple. "Do sit down." Mrs. Denham did not sit. She preferred to stand when making pronouncements. Chairs suggested debate. "I feel it my duty to say that there has been talk, unpleasant talk of poison. It is, in my view, un-English to speak in such a way before there is any official word. We all know what gossip does." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple. "It points like a little finger toward what we have not allowed ourselves to see." Mrs. Denham's expression softened, not at the sentiment, but at Miss Marple's manner of delivering it. "You are kindness itself. It is fortunate we have someone sensible among us. If you hear anything unwholesome, you will tell me." "If I hear anything that would make us safer by being told," said Miss Marple gently, "I will tell Inspector Lake." Mrs. Denham, disconcerted by the deflection, recovered to say, "Quite so, quite so. Well, one must not keep you from your tea." She turned, then turned back again. "Oh, and the mirror. That girl has taken it to Mrs. Redpath's. I cannot think what she will do with it. Display herself, I expect." "Mirrors are rarely to blame," said Miss Marple. After Mrs. Denham had gone, Miss Marple permitted herself a small sigh of relief. She liked Mrs. Denham in her way. The woman's fierce propriety was, in its fashion, a kind of courage. But courage could, when badly led, turn upon the wrong thing. She rose, and on an impulse reached for her cardigan and hat. It would be a simple matter, perfectly natural, to walk as far as the green and back, perhaps pausing by Mrs. Redpath's gate to admire the early delphiniums. It is extraordinary, she reflected, how often a person, encountering one unexpectedly, will say precisely the thing they had resolved to keep to themselves. The Redpath house stood in a prim row of villas, each with its little front garden and iron, railings freshly painted by a man whose brush had no respect for the boundaries between public and private metal. The delphiniums were indeed splendid, and Miss Marple bent to them with genuine appreciation. She had not been admiring them long when the front door opened and Lydia came out, a pair of lavender gloves in her hand. "How lovely," Miss Marple observed. "A colour to silence disagreements." "It is good of you to say so," Lydia returned with her grave little manner. "We have an excess of blue at present. Mrs. Redpath believes it soothing." They stood a moment, the older woman and the younger, with the faintest breeze teasing a loose strand of Lydia's hair. It was the sort of pause that invites truth if given the chance. "You are far from home, I think," said Miss Marple. She did not make it a question. Lydia's hands tightened on the gloves. "One is always far from home when one has left it behind." Then, as if she had said too much, she added quickly, "May I walk a little way with you?" They went together along the pavement. At the corner, Miss Marple stopped. "I was fond of Mr. Peterstone in a way," she said. "Not warm, you understand, but reliable. It is a shock to lose something reliable. It is like finding a loose stair in a staircase one has trodden all one's life." Lydia's lips pressed together. "He was not kind to everyone." "No," said Miss Marple, and waited. "He was a man who could keep things. Papers, as Mrs. Bartlett says. But there are other things to keep. Untruths, for instance. He kept those too. I do not say he invented them, only that he stored them, tidily, for a fee, and perhaps for the pleasure of it." "You disliked him," said Miss Marple gently. "I distrusted him." Lydia's chin lifted a fraction. "To distrust is a defense, Miss Marple. I have found it useful." They had reached the green. Children were rolling hoops, the reassuring sight of the ordinary persisting. Lydia looked at them and then away. "I should not have taken the mirror," she said abruptly. "I did not want it." "Yet you took it." "Yes." She gave the smallest, most hopeless laugh. "I always take what is offered. That is another defense." Miss Marple looked at her with a kindly acuteness that had both warmth and iron in it. "My dear," she said, "there are times when refusing a gift would make more enemies than accepting it, and one must always count one's enemies. A very wise woman told me that long ago. She said, 'If you cannot number them, you have too many.'" Lydia turned to her quickly. "How many have you?" "Oh," said Miss Marple, "women of my age do not inspire enmity. We are thought harmless. It is our great advantage." A movement on the far side of the green caught Lydia's eye. Robert Denham, head bare, coat flung over his shoulder, was crossing toward the lane that led to the mill path. His stride had the recklessness of a man who moves in order not to think. Lydia's face altered, then smoothed itself. "Good afternoon," she said, and held out her hand. "Thank you for your company." "It was mine," said Miss Marple. "A very pretty blue. Those delphiniums." When Lydia had gone, Miss Marple remained for a little while, watching the children and the clouds and the shifting faces of the village as they went about their small businesses. There was much to think of, and more that could not be thought of yet. But of one thing she was certain. The village had begun to whisper, and in the spaces between the whispers, a shape was forming that would soon be given a name. She turned back toward her cottage. As she reached her gate, a small figure detached itself from the shadow of the hedge. Constable Briggs, hat in hand, with the earnestness of a dog who has fetched a stick and does not know whether to drop it or be praised for holding it so firmly. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple," he said. "Inspector Lake sent me round. He was wondering, There's a thing we can't get straight. The cup, you see." "Yes?" "There was two of them. Begging your pardon, two cups near where Mr. Peterstone fell, one with a smear of jam on the rim, like somebody had been indiscreet with a scone, the other quite clean and nigh empty. We can't tell which was his." Miss Marple looked down at the constable's earnest shoes. "When people are enjoying themselves, constable, they often forget whose things are whose, but the person who remembers, very exactly, what belongs to whom is often the one with the most to lose." Briggs furrowed his brow, digesting this. "Inspector Lake thought you might have noticed something." "I noticed," said Miss Marple, "that Mr. Peterstone was a tidy man. If he had jam upon his cup, he would have wiped it away with his handkerchief rather than leave it there. Of course," she added, "if it had not been his jam." Briggs brightened as if a lantern had been lit. "Oh, yes. I'll tell the inspector." He hesitated. "And, Miss Marple, there's to be a search of Mr. Peterstone's office tomorrow. His clerk says all's in order, but order," said Miss Marple, "can be the best disguise." After he had gone, she stood very still for a moment, listening to the silence of her little house. Then she went in, put on the kettle, and took from her work-basket a length of fine lace in need of mending. Her fingers, old and clever, found the broken thread, drew it delicately through, and began to make it right. There is more than one way to mend a rent. Sometimes one must cut back a little to strengthen the join. Sometimes one must unpick. Outside, Rose Hill breathed in its new fear and breathed out stories. Somewhere in that exchange the truth was suspended, too light yet to fall, too heavy to float away. And behind a pane of polished glass in Mrs. Redpath's drawing-room, the old oak-framed mirror reflected a quiet room, a slender girl, and just for an instant, something moving behind her that was not there when she turned. Chapter 3. The Wrong Suspect. The inquest was set for Tuesday, and by Monday morning Rose Hill had arranged its opinions with all the precision of a flower show. Each household had its theory, stoutly held and loudly contradicted, though none could agree upon so much as the color of Mr. Peterstone's complexion when he fell. Inspector Lake, who had taken up temporary quarters at the inn, pursued his inquiries with a patience that was both admired and resented. He had the habit of listening with apparent gravity to the most improbable suggestions, and then by some quiet adjustment of tone, making his informant feel both gratified and slightly ridiculous. This, Miss Marple observed, was a useful quality in a man of his profession, but patience, however admirable, was not inexhaustible, and by Monday afternoon it had settled upon a particular quarter, Robert Denham. It began as such things do with a remark. Mrs. Bartlett, returning from the butcher's with a string bag full of mutton chops, confided to Miss Green that she had seen Robert lingering by the tea-tent just before Mr. Peterstone collapsed. "He had a look," she said darkly. "You know the sort, like a man with something on his conscience." Miss Green, repeating the story an hour later to Colonel Arbuthnot's housekeeper, omitted the tent and enlarged the look. By evening Robert had been seen tampering with the cups, a detail supplied, perhaps unconsciously, by someone who recalled the inspector's mention of cups. And by the time the story reached Mrs. Denham, who relayed it with righteous indignation to her husband, the young man was guilty of everything short of carrying a labelled poison bottle in his pocket. Dr. Denham, a fair-minded man, tried to protest. "Robert may be restless, even rash, but he is not a criminal." His wife set down her embroidery hoop with decision. "It is precisely his restlessness that makes him dangerous. I shall not have the village speculating about us. It must be faced." And so it was that Inspector Lake, having heard the rumor from 3 separate mouths, requested Robert's presence at the inn. The parlor of the Rose Hill Arms smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old upholstery. Robert Denham stood before the hearth with an air of defiance, his dark hair untidy, his hands shoved into his pockets as though he could not endure their idleness. Inspector Lake, seated at the table with his notebook, regarded him steadily. "You were seen near the tea-tent, Mr. Denham, just before Mr. Peterstone collapsed." "I was near many things," Robert retorted. If you mean to say I poisoned him, then you are a fool. Lake did not move. No one has said that. I am asking whether you observed anything unusual. Robert's laugh was short and harsh. Everything is unusual in this village. People stare, they whisper. Mr. Peterstone himself gave me advice this very morning. Unsolicited, I might add. He told me to make friends quickly, or I should find myself alone. And did you? Did I what? Make friends. The young man's jaw tightened. If by friends you mean people eager to gossip, then no. If you mean Miss Vane, he broke off, flushed. This is absurd. Absurdity, Lake observed, has often been the parent of truth. At this point the door opened, and Miss Marple, small and composed, entered with the air of one who has merely wandered in by chance. She had, in fact, been invited by Inspector Lake, who had quickly come to appreciate the peculiar advantages of her presence. "Dear me," she said mildly, "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," said Lake. "You may be able to help us." Robert made an impatient sound. "If you wish to believe I had a hand in Mr. Peterstone's death, you will believe it whether I speak or not." Miss Marple looked at him with kindly eyes. "Oh, no, dear. If you had truly poisoned Mr. Peterstone, you would not stand here so untidy and angry. Guilty men are much more careful. They remember to smooth their hair." Robert blinked, then gave a strangled laugh. "You are remarkable, Miss Marple." "Not at all. Only old." Inspector Lake cleared his throat. "Then perhaps you can tell me. Where precisely were you when Mr. Peterstone collapsed?" "By the raffle table," Robert said shortly. "I was watching Miss Vane." "And why?" The young man hesitated. His eyes flickered, not to Lake, but to Miss Marple. "Because she does not belong here, and because I thought she looked afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That," said Robert, "you must find out for yourself." By Tuesday morning the tide of gossip had become a torrent, and it was generally agreed that Robert Denham was the likely culprit. He had motive. What motive precisely no one could say, but motive nonetheless. He had opportunity. He had above all the misfortune to be a stranger in his own village, a young man with restless eyes and no occupation. Mrs. Bartlett told the greengrocer that she pitied Mrs. Denham most dreadfully. Miss Green whispered to her cat that justice must be done. Colonel Arbuthnot declared that in his regiment such matters were dealt with swiftly, and none the worse for it. Miss Marple, dusting her mantle and setting her clock a minute forward, thought otherwise. She thought of Robert's flush of temper, of Lydia Vane's glance in the mirror, of the quiet cup with its wiped clean rim. "No," she murmured, setting her duster aside, "it will not do at all." For Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of long years' observation, that the wrong person had already been chosen, and that, more dangerous than poison itself, was the most fatal mistake a village could make. Chapter 4. Secrets Revealed. The inquest, held in the oak-panelled room of the county courthouse, was brisk, factual, and deeply unsatisfying. The coroner, a small man with pince-nez that perpetually slid down his nose, concluded that Mr. Peterstone had died of sudden collapse, possibly connected with ingestion of a noxious substance, pending further analysis. It was a phrase that gave neither comfort nor clarity, and it left the villagers both alarmed and curiously emboldened. By evening, Rose Hill was humming with theories of an altogether more dramatic order. Some whispered of exotic poisons brought back from foreign parts. Here a sly glance toward Robert Denham. Others spoke of bitter disputes over wills, or of secrets too perilous to commit to paper. The pub, the post office, the butcher's, and the church steps all became, for a time, little courtrooms where everyone was both judge and jury. Miss Marple, who had listened with patient courtesy to 3 competing explanations in the space of one morning, knew that gossip is not merely idle talk. It is a map, distorted, inaccurate, but useful all the same. The trick lies in noticing where the lines agree. It was during her customary Tuesday call on Lady Phoebe Winterton that Miss Marple heard the first true crack in Rose Hill's polished surface. Lady Phoebe lived at Marleycombe Hall, a rambling house set among gardens once grand but now overgrown. She was a fragile woman, all faded silks and wistful glances, who devoted herself to roses and memories of the late Sir Julian. She received Miss Marple in the long drawing-room, where bowls of petals drooped under their own scent. "I must say," Lady Phoebe began, her hands fluttering like pale moths, "it has shaken me terribly. To think of poor Mr. Peterstone so correct, so precise, falling in such a way, at the fete of all places. It quite overset me. I was quite unable to sleep, Miss Marple, though my maid gave me a tisane." Miss Marple murmured sympathy, noting the deepening shadows beneath her hostess's eyes. "And yet," Lady Phoebe continued, "perhaps it was to be expected. He was not a young man, and one must say, though it seems unkind, that he made enemies." "Indeed?" "Oh, yes. People came to him with their troubles, their debts, their indiscretions. He was most obliging in some ways, but he had a manner of keeping things. Not only papers, but knowledge. I do not say he threatened, but one could not be entirely at ease with him. Poor Sir Julian once remarked that Peterstone was like a cupboard that locked itself from within. He knew far too much." Miss Marple, smoothing a crease in her glove, said gently, "Did he, perhaps, know something of yourself, Lady Phoebe?" Her hostess gave a little laugh, brittle as thin china. "My dear Miss Marple, every widow has her foolishness. I dare say he knew mine." She paused, then added in a tone of sudden candour, "But I did not kill him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course not, though I fancy you are not the only one who could make that declaration." Meanwhile, Inspector Lake pursued his inquiries into Mr. Peterstone's office. The small, dusty room above the High Street shop was crammed with pigeonholes and tin boxes, all neatly labelled in Peterstone's precise hand. The clerk, a nervous young man with spectacles, insisted that everything was in order. Yet it was quickly discovered that one file, a recent will concerning a property on the far side of Rose Hill, was missing. The will belonged to Mrs. Redpath. The news spread rapidly, as such things do. Mrs. Bartlett declared at once that it was proof. Proof of what, she did not say, but her neighbour understood it as proof of mischief, and repeated it as such. By the time the tale reached the postmistress, the missing document was nothing less than a damning accusation. Mrs. Redpath herself received the inspector with stiff dignity. "My late husband was a methodical man," she declared. "He revised his will more often than his wardrobe. Mr. Peterstone advised him, and after his death I entrusted Mr. Peterstone with the keeping of the new document. If it is not there, then something is gravely amiss." "And you are quite certain you did not take it back?" asked Lake. "Inspector," Mrs. Redpath said coldly, "I may be absent-minded with my teacups, but I do not mislay my fortune." Miss Marple, present at the interview on the grounds of neighbourly concern, said mildly, "It is surprising, perhaps, that such a careful man should be careless in this one instance." Mrs. Redpath coloured faintly. "Careless, Mr. Peterstone? Never." "Unless," said Miss Marple, with her usual air of absent-mindedness, "he wished the will not to be found." There was a little silence. The inspector's pencil stilled. Mrs. Redpath's lips pressed into a thin line. "You mean blackmail?" she said at last, with a certain grim relish. "Yes, that was always possible." That evening, walking home across the green, Miss Marple encountered Lydia Vane. The girl was pale, her fair hair untidy under her hat, and she carried herself with the tension of one who expects reproach. "I hear," Lydia said abruptly, "that people think Robert killed him." "People will always think the easiest thing," Miss Marple replied. "It is not easy for Robert," Lydia retorted with sudden heat. "They watch him, they whisper. He has done nothing." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "And you, my dear? Have you done nothing?" Lydia's face changed. For a moment her poise slipped. and there was something raw beneath it. "I have tried to live," she said in a low voice. "That is not always the same as doing nothing." And before Miss Marple could reply, she turned and walked quickly away, her figure soon lost in the deepening dusk. That night Miss Marple sat by her lamp with her knitting. The room was quiet, save for the clock on the mantel and the faint click of her needles. She thought of Lady Phoebe's brittle confession, of Mrs. Redpath's missing will, of Lydia's sudden burst of passion. She thought, too, of Robert Denham's angry flush, of the mirror's polished surface, of the cup so curiously clean. Secrets, she reflected, are like weeds in a garden. Pull one, and another springs up where you least expect it. Yet there is always one root that runs beneath them all, and it was that root Miss Marple meant to find. Chapter 5. A Second Shock. On Wednesday morning the village was still debating Mr. Peterstone's mysterious end when a new disturbance fell upon it, like a stone into a pond already troubled. This time it was not death, but something uncanny enough to rattle even the most sceptical. It began at Mrs. Redpath's villa, where Lydia Vane had taken her prize from the fete, the great oak-framed mirror. Mrs. Redpath was proud to show it off. "A piece of distinction," she declared to all callers, "and placed just where it reflects the length of my drawing-room. One might be forgiven for thinking one had twice the furniture." But that morning the maid, young Kitty, scarcely 16, ran shrieking into the kitchen, pale as milk. She had gone in with the duster and seen something in the mirror, she insisted, something that was not in the room at all. A face, watching. By the time Inspector Lake was sent for, the story had grown, and half Rosehill was murmuring that the mirror was cursed. Mrs. Bartlett, hearing of it in the grocer's, said knowingly, "Did I not tell you? There's always something behind these old things. You can't tell what they've seen." Miss Marple, summoned to Mrs. Redpath's by what was described as a most alarming upset, arrived to find the drawing-room filled with anxious people. Mrs. Redpath herself, full of outraged dignity, Lydia Vane, white and still, Kitty, tearful and clinging to the housekeeper, and Inspector Lake, standing before the mirror with grave composure. "It is only glass," he said firmly. "Nothing more." "But she saw something," Mrs. Redpath insisted. "I cannot have servants frightened out of their wits. The girl is useless, Inspector, quite useless. And Lydia, you do not look much better." Lydia said nothing. She stood near the window, her eyes fixed not on the glass but on the floor. Miss Marple moved closer, peering at the mirror's surface. The room was reflected with perfect clarity. The stiff-backed chairs, the vase of delphiniums, the people themselves, caught like figures in a photograph. Yet there was something, yes, a faint smear, as though a hand had pressed against the glass. "Curious," she murmured. "Merely a mark," said Lake. The maid's imagination did the rest. But Miss Marple's eyes were very thoughtful. She knew that young girls sometimes saw things because they wished to, but they also sometimes saw things because they were there. That evening a more tangible shock arrived. Colonel Arbuthnot, returning from his walk, discovered his study window forced and his bureau rifled. Nothing appeared to be missing, save for one small deed box containing documents he had deposited with Mr. Peterstone only the week before. The colonel stormed into the vicarage, demanding that the inspector take action. "Damn it, Lake. It's not burglary, it's a campaign. First Peterstone, now me. Someone's after papers, that's plain enough." "What papers?" asked Lake. "My sister's settlement," the colonel snapped, "and certain bonds, all quite regular, but confound it, they were confidential." When Miss Marple, hearing of the incident, asked whether anyone else in the house had heard a disturbance, the colonel's housekeeper confessed she had thought she heard a tap at the window earlier, but, "Well, ma'am, I didn't like to fuss." "Not fussing," said Miss Marple gently, "can be a very dangerous habit." By Thursday the village was in uproar. The mysterious mirror, the frightened maid, the burglary, each seemed to add a fresh layer to the unease that already gripped Rosehill. People spoke of A reign of terror, though it had lasted scarcely a week. In the Redpath villa, Lydia sat in the drawing-room with her hands folded tightly in her lap, gazing at the mirror as if it might speak. Robert Denham came to see her, striding in with that restlessness that never quite left him. "You must leave this place," he said fiercely. "It's no good for you. They'll turn on you, as they've turned on me." Lydia looked up, her expression weary. "And where should I go, Robert? There is no place where whispers do not follow." "You speak as if—" He broke off, biting his lip, "as if there were something to whisper about." "There always is," Lydia said quietly. Unseen by them, Miss Marple, passing on her way to the garden, paused a moment outside the open window. She had no wish to eavesdrop, but sometimes the wind carries fragments of truth, and it would be foolish not to hear them. She thought of Lady Phoebe's remark, "A cupboard locked from within." Yes, but cupboards could be opened if one found the right key. That night, as the lamps of Rosehill were doused one by one, Miss Marple sat up later than usual, her knitting idle in her lap. She reviewed the pattern forming before her. Mr. Peterstone, the keeper of secrets, dead by poison, a missing will belonging to Mrs. Redpath, a burglary at the Colonel's with documents taken, a frightened maid claiming to see a face in the mirror, Lydia Vane watchful and withdrawn, carrying some unspoken weight, Robert Denham angry, restless, and too quickly suspected. A pattern indeed, but not yet a picture. Still, she was certain of one thing. The mirror did not merely keep a secret, it showed one. And someone, somewhere in Rosehill, was desperate enough to kill again, rather than let it be revealed. Chapter 6. Miss Marple Pays a Call. By Friday morning, the panic in Rosehill had settled into a curious blend of defiance and dread. Villagers spoke loudly of burglars and poisoners, always they, never he or she, and shook their heads in solemn dismay. Yet doors that had stood open for years were now locked at dusk, and shutters were drawn against the night. The butcher complained that no one lingered to gossip over chops, and even Mrs. Bartlett confessed to Miss Marple that she had taken to peering under her bed before retiring. "It isn't the sort of thing one expects in a place like this," she concluded, with the air of a woman who had been cheated. "One might as well live in London, what with all the goings-on." "Human nature," Miss Marple observed gently, "is much the same in London or Rosehill. Only in villages it is harder to hide." Miss Marple, who believed firmly that truth was best uncovered by a series of seemingly innocent visits, began her quiet round of the village that morning. She had a way of appearing to drop in quite by chance, a lace cap of politeness covering the sharpest of needles. Her first call was on Mrs. Redpath. The widow received her with an air of injured dignity, clearly still distressed by the loss of her late husband's will. "Of course," Mrs. Redpath declared, "I shall set the matter right at once with another solicitor. But it is disgraceful, Miss Marple, quite disgraceful. To think of one's private affairs handled so carelessly. If Mr. Redpath were alive—" She broke off, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief more notable for its lace than for its sincerity. "You were very fond of your husband," said Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Redpath looked startled. "Fond? Well, naturally. A devoted wife, everyone knows it." She paused, then added, "He was very particular, very set in his ways, but I managed him." "Managed?" "Oh yes, a woman must, especially with men who are inclined to be strict." She gave a little laugh, sharp-edged. "But he provided, I cannot deny that. And now his will vanished. I cannot but think poor Mr. Peterstone was careless." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes, clear and blue, rested on the mirror now occupying pride of place in the drawing-room. It reflected Mrs. Redpath very faithfully indeed, the hard set of her mouth, the restless hands upon her lap. From Mrs. Redpath's, Miss Marple walked slowly to Marleycombe Hall. Lady Phoebe was in her rose garden, hat askew, secateurs dangling forgotten from her hand. "My dear Miss Marple," she said faintly, "is it not dreadful to lose a man like Mr. Peterstone, who kept everything so perfectly, though one never knew what he might say, of course, I feel quite unsafe, as though the roses themselves might be whispering secrets to each other. You were acquainted with him for some years, I believe? Oh, yes. He advised Sir Julian in everything. He had papers, of course, and when Sir Julian died, well, one did not like to think what those papers contained. He had a way of looking, you know, dry, very dry, as though he saw everything, even when you wished to keep it hidden. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. It can be most uncomfortable when people look too closely, though sometimes it is not what they see, but what they guess. That unsettles us. Lady Phoebe's eyes flickered. You are very perceptive. There was a time, years ago, of foolishness that he might have known. But Sir Julian forgave me. At least I think he did. And now Mr. Peterstone is gone, and perhaps that is best. Only, she shivered, dropping the secateurs. Only I fear the manner of his going has stirred up what should have remained quiet. Miss Marple's last call that day was at the vicarage. She found Mrs. Denham in the garden, briskly dead-heading roses with a determination that suggested the blooms themselves had offended her. My dear Miss Marple, she began at once, this has been a most trying week. People are saying the wildest things. About mirrors of all absurdities. I have told them quite firmly that it is nonsense. The inspector ought to put a stop to it. Miss Marple folded her hands. Sometimes, when people are frightened, it is better to let them talk. Silences can be more dangerous than words. Mrs. Denham looked at her keenly. You have noticed something. Only that fear is very revealing. It shows where we feel weakest, and people seldom reveal their weaknesses unless pressed. Mrs. Denham gave a sharp nod. Quite so. Well, I shall not indulge in weakness. But between ourselves, Miss Marple, I do not trust that girl, Lydia. There is something in her manner. Too quiet, too self-contained. And Robert is infatuated, of course. It is quite unsuitable. Quite unsuitable. Miss Marple merely said, Young men often make unsuitable choices. Sometimes they live to regret them. Sometimes they do not. That evening, as the church clock struck 9, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. Her hands moved steadily, but her mind was busy arranging the fragments she had gathered. Mrs. Redpath, devoted but managing, uneasy about her late husband's strictness. Lady Phoebe, once foolish, now afraid that old secrets were stirring. Mrs. Denham, fierce in her propriety, but indignant about Lydia's presence. Lydia herself, haunted, watchful, with Robert hovering too near. Colonel Arbuthnot, blustering about his stolen deed-box. A village full of secrets, Miss Marple thought, and secrets once disturbed seldom lie quietly again. The click of her needles slowed. A thought had occurred to her, an old memory, of another village, another death. There had been a mirror then, too, and something reflected in it that no one wished to see. Yes, she murmured, softly. It is much the same. She laid down her knitting and folded her hands. Outside the night was still, but in Rose Hill she knew the quiet was only a veil. Something moved behind it, restless, dangerous, and growing bolder with each passing day. Chapter 7. A telling slip. Inspector Lake was nothing if not methodical. By Saturday morning he had taken yet another statement from Robert Denham, questioned Lydia Vane twice, and dispatched Constable Briggs to prowl the lanes of Rose Hill with the air of a bloodhound, eager but none too clever. The village, meanwhile, congratulated itself that the inspector knew his business, though privately most people thought they themselves knew it better. Robert, restless and sullen, had become the favourite suspect. That he had no occupation, that he was seen near the tea-tent, that he stared far too much at Miss Vane. All these things were added up into a kind of equation that yielded only one answer. But Miss Marple, who knew something of sums, felt that the village had put its numbers into the wrong columns. The first slip came not from Robert, but from Colonel Arbuthnot. Miss Marple encountered him outside the post office, his moustache bristling like a heraldic device, his cane tapping the pavement in a manner designed to convey outrage. Disgraceful, Miss Marple. That's what it is. Absolutely disgraceful. I told Lake as much this morning. Burglars in Rose Hill, and important papers gone. I am so sorry, Colonel. You must feel most unsettled. Unsettled? I am damned if I'll be unsettled. He lowered his voice, though not quite enough. It was my sister's settlement papers, and certain notes. Not the kind one wishes paraded about, you understand. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Private matters are always awkward if they fall into the wrong hands. Precisely. And Peterstone had copies, knew the whole thing backwards. That's the trouble with solicitors. Too much knowledge. And then, with a sudden, unthinking gust of temper, he added, if he'd kept his nose out of it, he'd be alive still. There was a tiny silence. The Colonel's face reddened. I mean, if he hadn't been so damned meticulous. Nothing but bad luck, of course. He clicked his cane against the pavement, saluted Miss Marple with unnecessary vigor, and strode away. Miss Marple stood very still for a moment, watching him vanish down the lane. Then she turned to the post office window, where Miss Green, the postmistress, was pretending to arrange envelopes but listening intently. Miss Marple entered, bought a packet of pins she did not need, and inquired after Miss Green's cat, thus diverting her neatly from repeating the Colonel's outburst too soon. But in her own mind, Miss Marple recorded the slip with quiet precision. If he'd kept his nose out of it, he'd be alive still. It was not the remark of a man merely inconvenienced. It was the remark of a man who felt threatened. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Lydia Vane. Mrs. Redpath, resplendent in mauve, was out visiting, and Lydia received her alone in the drawing-room where the mirror hung. The girl was pale, her hands restless. The mirror reflected her with cruel accuracy, making her seem thinner, more fragile, as though the very act of being looked at diminished her. I am so glad you came, Lydia said abruptly. I feel quite watched here, as though every glance in the street were a question. And the mirror, she broke off. You must think me foolish. Not at all, said Miss Marple, lowering herself into a chair. Many people find mirrors disconcerting. They show us what others see, but not always what we know of ourselves. Lydia's eyes flickered toward the glass. I sometimes think, she said in a low voice, that it shows more than it ought. Miss Marple followed her gaze. For just an instant she thought she saw movement in the reflection. Not Lydia, but something shifting behind her. When she looked directly, the room was empty. Perhaps, said Miss Marple gently, it is not the mirror but our consciences that show us too much. Lydia pressed her lips together. Then in a burst she said, Mr. Peterstone threatened me. He did not say so in words, but he hinted. He knew something, from before I came here. He smiled, that little dry smile of his, and said I ought to be careful, for secrets have a way of coming out. And what did you reply? I said nothing. I never do. That is my way of defending myself. Silence. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Silence can be a shield, my dear, but sometimes it is also a confession. Lydia gave a little cry, half of protest, half of despair. I did not kill him. Of course not, said Miss Marple soothingly. If you had, you would have chosen a place less public. Poison at a fete is like throwing a stone into a pond. The ripples spread too far. No, my dear, you did not kill him. Lydia stared at her. How can you be so sure? Because, said Miss Marple, you are far too frightened. That evening Inspector Lake came to Miss Marple's cottage. He looked tired but resolute. I've had enough of Denham's evasions, he said. The young man is quick-tempered, restless, and clearly infatuated. I shall take him into custody for questioning more closely. Miss Marple poured him tea with her usual delicacy. And if he is innocent? Then he will be released. And if he is guilty? Then justice will be done. Miss Marple looked at him with her mild, bird-like eyes. I do admire your determination, Inspector. Only, forgive me, I think you are looking at the wrong end of the telescope. Robert Denham is angry, yes. He is foolish, yes. But he is not careful, and this crime inspector was very careful indeed. Lake frowned, setting down his cup. You mean someone else? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I mean many someone else's, but one in particular will have made a slip. They always do. We must be patient. As the church clock struck 10, Miss Marple took up her knitting. The colonel's careless words, Lydia's frightened confession, the inspector's determination to pursue Robert, all threaded themselves into her thoughts. The pattern was forming, and somewhere, in the quiet lanes of Rose Hill, the murderer believed they were still safe. They had not yet realized that safety vanishes the moment one speaks without thinking. Chapter 8. Motives. Uncovered. Sunday dawned with the sort of deceptive calm that makes English villages appear timeless. The church bell, the clop of a pony trap, the faint smell of bacon drifting from cottage chimneys. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm, Rose Hill was shifting uneasily, like a sleeper disturbed by troubling dreams. Inspector Lake continued to tighten his net around Robert Denham, but Miss Marple saw that suspicion, once cast, had a way of catching others. Old grievances, buried quarrels, and carefully hidden misdeeds began to stir. The villagers, so proud of their respectability, now looked at one another with wary eyes. At the post office that morning, Miss Marple heard Mrs. Bartlett's latest pronouncement. Well, if you ask me, it's about money. It always is. That solicitor knew too much about people's affairs. If he's been, embezzling, then perhaps someone found him out. Miss Green pursed her lips. I heard it was not his money he meddled with, but other people's. Lady Phoebe's, for one. Some arrangement about her roses, if you please. Mortgaged half the whole, so they say. Roses don't pay bills, Mrs. Bartlett declared. She'll have found that out. Miss Marple, paying for her stamps, murmured a polite good morning, and thought, not for the first time, how remarkably quick scandal is to blossom in village soil. Later that day she called at Marleycombe Hall. Lady Phoebe received her in the library, a room whose shelves bore more dust than books. The lady herself seemed fluttered, her hands restless among the rose catalogues spread before her. My dear Miss Marple, she said, you cannot think how distressed I am. Inspector Lake asked me questions this morning, very pointed questions, about Sir Julian's will and my own arrangements with Mr. Peterstone, as though I could possibly understand those dreadful papers. Were there difficulties, perhaps? Miss Marple asked gently. Only debts, Lady Phoebe admitted, lowering her voice as though the leather-bound volumes might overhear. The roses, the estate. It all cost so much, and Sir Julian left matters rather entangled. Mr. Peterstone arranged a mortgage. He said it was quite in order. But then, he smiled, you know, that thin smile, and said I must be sure the whole did not fall into the wrong hands. I thought at the time it was kindly meant. Now I wonder whether it was a warning, Miss Marple suggested. Lady Phoebe pressed her handkerchief to her lips. I cannot bear to think of it. But if my affairs were in his hands, then perhaps his death was not so sudden as we were told. From the hall, Miss Marple walked down to Willow House, where Colonel Arbuthnot, still bristling over his burglary, was dictating letters to his long-suffering housekeeper. He greeted Miss Marple with bluster that scarcely concealed unease. Confounded nuisance, this business. My papers gone, my bureau forced. Lake has the hide of an ox if he thinks I can sit by while thieves poke into my family's settlements. It must be very distressing, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Settlements can be delicate things. Sometimes they favor one relation more than another. Feelings can be hurt. The colonel coughed. That is women's talk. These are straightforward bonds. But his eyes shifted, and Miss Marple, who had seen such eyes before, knew there was more in that box than bonds. On Monday, Mrs. Denham herself was overheard in the greengrocer's declaring that Lydia Vane had entangled her nephew. She is altogether unsuitable, she told the shopkeeper with righteous indignation. A girl with no family, no background. My Robert ought to be thinking of his prospects, not mooning about after a stranger. The remark reached Miss Marple within the hour, borne on the same swift current that carried every scrap of gossip through Rosehill. She tucked it away with care, for young men do not make convenient scapegoats without someone's encouragement, and Mrs. Denham had always been a woman who managed her household with a firm hand. That evening Miss Marple entertained Inspector Lake to tea in her little parlour. The inspector, tired and weary, accepted her seed cake with gratitude. "You seem troubled," Miss Marple said gently. "It's these motives," Lake confessed. "I hear of money owed, wills missing, papers stolen. But which thread leads to Peter Stone's death? Too many, perhaps. Too many to pull at once." "Ah," Miss Marple said, "but some threads are stronger than others. Money, yes, property, yes, but those are only the outer garments. Beneath them there is always pride, jealousy, or shame. That is the cloth people cannot bear to have torn." Lake studied her keenly. "You think it personal, then, not merely financial?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that when people kill, it is seldom only for money. There is usually something more, an old wound, a fear of disgrace, or the bitterness of love gone wrong." When Lake had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly by her fire, her hands folded on her lap. She thought of Lady Phoebe, fluttering among her roses, of Colonel Arbuthnot, bristling over his settlements, of Mrs. Redpath, fiercely guarding her respectability, of Mrs. Denham, fighting to control her nephew's future. Yes, the motives were there, each one plausible, each one sharp enough to cut. But which blade had struck Mr. Peter Stone? She looked up at the small mirror above her mantle. It reflected her face, lined and gentle, her neat cap, the little table at her elbow. Nothing more. But in Mrs. Redpath's drawing-room another mirror was waiting, and Miss Marple, with the certainty of long habit, knew that it had already shown too much. Chapter 9. An Unlucky Accident. On Tuesday afternoon the village of Rosehill was startled by a cry that echoed across the green. Kitty, the maid at Mrs. Redpath's, had fallen from the landing window while cleaning. She lay on the gravel path below, mercifully alive but badly shaken, her ankle twisted and her face pale as chalk. By the time Miss Marple reached the villa, Inspector Lake was already there, standing grimly beside the frightened girl. Mrs. Redpath fluttered with indignation, declaring that she could not have her servants risking their necks over a pane of glass. Lydia Vane stood apart, silent, her face set. "It was the mirror," Kitty sobbed. "I'd been told to polish it, and when I leaned close, I thought I saw— oh, I don't know what I saw, but it frightened me. I slipped, that's all. Honest, sir, I didn't jump." Lake frowned. "No one said you did, but it was careless work." Miss Marple bent down to the girl, her voice soft. "There, my dear, no harm in being frightened. We all are sometimes. Did anyone else come into the room while you were there?" Kitty shook her head, then hesitated. "Only, I thought I heard the latch, as if someone touched the door. But when I turned, no one was there." Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "That is very helpful." When the inspector withdrew to speak to Mrs. Redpath, Miss Marple remained in the drawing-room. The mirror stood in its place, reflecting the quiet scene with blank composure. She moved closer, studying the carved oak frame, the faint smudge upon the glass, and the angle at which it caught the door. "Curious," she murmured. "One might see more in this mirror than is meant." Lydia's voice came softly behind her. "Kitty might have seen something she was not meant to. That's why she was frightened." Miss Marple turned, her blue eyes mild but sharp. "And perhaps why someone wished her frightened enough to fall." Lydia flinched. "You mean—" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that people who hold secrets sometimes forget that children notice things. And servants too. They are part of the furniture, until suddenly they are not." By evening the accident was the talk of Rosehill. Mrs. Bartlett declared that the mirror was haunted. Colonel Arbuthnot thundered that it was nonsense. Mrs. Denham hinted broadly that it was convenient, very convenient, that the one witness to any strange goings-on should now be confined to bed. Miss Marple, hearing all this, said nothing. She was thinking of Kitty's words, the sound of a latch, a door touched, no one there. It fitted too neatly with her own observation of the mirror's angle, the way it caught reflections of what was behind. Someone had stood in that doorway, unseen, someone who preferred to remain so. That night Miss Marple sat up later than usual. Her knitting lay idle as she pieced together the pattern. Mr. Peterstone dead by poison, a keeper of secrets, silenced, a missing will, a rifled bureau, debts and settlements tangled like weeds, a frightened girl, almost silenced by accident, a mirror that showed more than was comfortable. Yes, the threads were drawing tighter, and Miss Marple, who had seen many patterns in her long life, knew what such tightening meant. The murderer was growing desperate, and desperation, she reflected, is always untidy. It leaves traces. The following morning she walked to the vicarage with her knitting basket on her arm, appearing every inch the harmless old lady. Yet her mind was sharp as a needle. She meant to ask certain small questions, the kind no policeman ever thinks to ask, but which can pierce a lie like a thorn through fabric. For in Rosehill, Miss Marple knew, another slip was bound to come, and when it did, she must be ready. Chapter 10. Miss Marple asks questions. Wednesday morning was fresh and bright, the kind of day that would ordinarily have seen Rosehill at its most cheerful. Gardeners clipping hedges, children running across the green, and housewives hanging out washing with brisk satisfaction. Yet beneath the ordinary bustle there ran a tautness, as though the village held its breath. Miss Marple, however, appeared wholly untroubled as she made her way along the lane with her knitting basket over her arm. She moved slowly, stopping to admire roses, to exchange a word here and there, to inquire after a rheumatic knee or a troublesome hen. It was the gentlest of progressions, but each pause, each question, was deliberate. For Miss Marple, like a patient botanist, knew that if you lean down and examine carefully, even the smallest flowers will reveal what soil they grow from. Her first call was at Willow House. Colonel Arbuthnot received her in his study, his moustache more bristling than ever, his cane within reach. "Most good of you to look in, Miss Marple. Confounded nuisance, this business with the papers. Lake tells me he can make nothing of it." "I expect it is all very bewildering," Miss Marple said kindly, taking the chair nearest the window. "So many papers, some important, some not. I always find it difficult to know which to burn and which to keep." The colonel stiffened. "Burn? Certainly not. Every scrap was of value." Miss Marple's eyes were mild. "Ah, then it is a mercy the burglars did not know which were most important. One never likes to imagine private family matters falling into the wrong hands." For just a moment, the colonel's face darkened, and he tapped his cane sharply against the floor. "Quite so. But you may rest assured, Miss Marple, there is nothing discreditable, nothing at all." "Of course not," said Miss Marple, rising with her pleasant smile. But she noted the slip, just as she noted the papers on his desk shuffled into disorder. A man so proud of his military neatness did not scatter his documents without reason. At Marleycombe Hall, Lady Phoebe Winterton received her in the morning room, a shawl about her shoulders, though the day was warm. "My dear Miss Marple," she said, "it is all too dreadful. And now poor Kitty's accident. Oh, I cannot bear mirrors. I had them covered in black when Sir Julian died. I should have kept them covered." "It must be a strain," Miss Marple said gently, "having one's affairs examined so closely. Mr. Peterstone must have known a great deal about your late husband's estate." Lady Phoebe's fingers tightened on her shawl. "He knew everything, every debt, every mortgage, every foolishness. He advised me, yes, but he also hinted. He liked to remind one that nothing could be hidden." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Perhaps that is why someone wished to silence him." Lady Phoebe gave a startled little gasp, then pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "You do not mean—" "Oh, Miss Marple, you frighten me." "My dear, I should not wish to do that. but sometimes fear clears the mind. In the afternoon, Miss Marple stopped at the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Denham arranging flowers with vigorous hands. Such a fuss about nothing, Mrs. Denham declared at once. The inspector must put an end to it. Mirrors, indeed, as though reflections could kill a man. They cannot kill, Miss Marple agreed, but they can reveal. Sometimes one sees more than one intends. Mrs. Denham's lips tightened. Then one ought not to look. She thrust a rose too sharply into the vase, breaking the stem. I have told Robert as much. That girl Lydia, always gazing into that mirror as though she were waiting for something to appear. It is not healthy. Poor child, Miss Marple said softly. She is very much alone. She has chosen to be alone, Mrs. Denham said coldly, and she has ensnared Robert with her mysterious airs. A woman with no family, no past. Do you wonder that people suspect her? Miss Marple folded her hands. I have always thought, dear Mrs. Denham, that when people are too mysterious, it is because others have not asked the right questions. Mrs. Denham flushed. Well, I am not in the habit of prying. Ah, said Miss Marple, but sometimes one must. By evening, Miss Marple had gathered her fragments. The Colonel, fearful of family secrets. Lady Phoebe, hinting at debts and foolishness. Mrs. Denham, angry at Lydia and fearful of scandal. Each protestation, each deflection had revealed more than its speaker intended. As she sat by her fire, her needles clicking, Miss Marple reflected that truth in a village is like a thread in a piece of lace. Tug one end, and the whole pattern trembles. And somewhere, she knew, the murderer had felt that tremble. They would strike again. She was sure of it. Chapter 11. A second attempt. It was Thursday evening when the village received its second true shock. The sun had set in a crimson band, and a thin mist crept across the meadows as people went about their ordinary routines. Lamps lit, curtains drawn, kettles humming. Nothing, in short, to suggest danger. Yet danger had already entered Rose Hill. Robert Denham, restless as ever, had gone walking along the mill path that skirted the stream. He often did so when troubled, as though the rhythm of his stride might quiet his thoughts. That night, however, his walk nearly ended in disaster. At a bend in the path where the bank rose steeply, a heavy stone dislodged itself from the edge above and crashed down, striking the ground inches from where Robert stood. Startled, he sprang back, his heart pounding. Another step, and the stone would have broken his skull. He looked up sharply. For an instant, no more, he thought he saw movement against the skyline, a figure dark and indistinct vanishing into the trees. By the time he reached the vicarage, dishevelled and pale, his story was half disbelief, half outrage. "Someone tried to kill me," he declared, his eyes blazing. "And you say I am the suspect? Damn it, I nearly had my brains dashed out." Dr. Denham did his best to calm him, but his wife shook her head grimly. "It may have been an accident. Stones fall, banks crumble. Robert exaggerates." But Robert would not be silenced. "I saw someone," he insisted. "They wanted me dead, and you all know it." Inspector Lake arrived within the hour, summoned from the inn. He examined the path, the stone, the marks on the bank. His expression grew darker. "It could be accident," he admitted, "but it could just as easily have been pushed." He looked hard at Robert. "And you are certain you saw someone?" "Yes," Robert said fiercely, "though I couldn't swear to who." "Convenient," murmured Mrs. Denham. Robert turned on her. "You don't believe me, Aunt? Then ask Miss Marple. She'll know. She always does." Miss Marple, fetched from her cottage, listened quietly to the account. Her eyes, mild as ever, rested on Robert's flushed face, then moved thoughtfully to Mrs. Denham, whose lips were pressed tight in disapproval. "It is most alarming," Miss Marple said softly. "Though accidents do happen." Robert gave a cry of protest. "You too!" She patted his arm. Now, one must not leap to conclusions. But tell me, were you expected on the mill path tonight?" "No," Robert admitted. "I walked there because I couldn't think indoors. No one knew. Miss Marple folded her hands. Then whoever pushed the stone was very fortunate indeed, or very watchful. Inspector Lake glanced at her sharply. I mean, said Miss Marple, that the danger may not have been meant for Robert at all, but someone was watching, someone who knew who walked that path, and when. That night Rosehill was more unsettled than ever. Doors were bolted, lamps left burning late. Mrs. Bartlett declared that murder stalked the lanes. Colonel Arbuthnot swore he would sit up with his revolver. Lady Phoebe shut herself in her room and refused to see visitors, and Lydia Vane, when she heard what had happened, grew very pale. "He is in danger," she whispered, "because of me." Miss Marple, who had come to sit with her, said quietly, "Oh no, my dear. He is in danger because of someone else entirely. But your fear tells me something. You must not be too quick to take blame that does not belong to you." Lydia looked at her, eyes wide. "Then who—" Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on the mirror, which reflected them both in its faithful, unpitying glass. "The one who fears reflection, my dear. Always that one." When Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she sat long by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The attempt on Robert had not been clumsy. It had been desperate. Desperate people revealed themselves. The trap, she thought, would not be long in setting itself. Chapter 12. Closing the net. By Friday morning, Rosehill was humming with two contradictory stories. One version had it that Robert Denham had narrowly escaped death at the hands of some unknown villain. The other, whispered with relish in cottages and shops, was that Robert himself had staged the accident in order to draw suspicion away from his own guilt. Inspector Lake, weary-eyed after little sleep, leaned toward the latter. "He is the obvious thread," the inspector told Miss Marple as they walked together by the churchyard. "No money, no prospects, a temper he cannot master, and this infatuation with Miss Vane. I dare say Peterstone stood in his way somehow, perhaps with money, perhaps with knowledge. Robert is exactly the sort of fellow to strike out recklessly and then pretend to be a victim." Miss Marple looked down at the graves, her eyes very thoughtful. "Yes, Inspector. But recklessness and poison seldom go together. Poison is neat, quiet, and above all careful. Young men in love rarely are." Lake frowned. "You think him innocent?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that innocence and guilt do not always wear the faces we expect, and when a man nearly dies by a falling stone, one ought to ask whether he was the intended target, or merely a substitute." Lake said nothing, but his pencil tapped irritably against his notebook. Meanwhile, the village's gossip grew harsher. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bartlett declared that she had always thought Robert wild, while Miss Green insisted that a guilty conscience will sometimes try to shift the blame by imagining attacks. Colonel Arbuthnot was heard to mutter that if the inspector failed to act, he himself would see to it. Even Mrs. Denham, ordinarily so careful of her dignity, was overheard by her maid saying that her nephew had brought nothing but disgrace since his return. Robert, for his part, paced the Denhams' garden like a caged animal, lashing out at every hint of accusation. "Let them arrest me if they dare," he told Lydia bitterly. "At least then I'd know where I stood." Lydia, pale and silent, clasped his hand but said nothing. Miss Marple, moving quietly from house to house under the pretext of carrying messages or returning borrowed books, observed all of this with her usual mild attention. She saw the Colonel's nervous hands, Lady Phoebe's sudden silences, Mrs. Redpath's too loud indignation, and Mrs. Denham's cold composure. Each reaction was a tile in the mosaic she was assembling. When she returned to her cottage that evening, she found Inspector Lake waiting. His jaw was set. "I've made up my mind," he said. "I shall bring Denham in formally tomorrow. He is at the heart of this, one way or another. It may shake something loose." Miss Marple removed her gloves and placed them neatly on the table. "It will shake something loose, Inspector, that I do not doubt. But be careful what you shake. Sometimes it is the wrong fruit that falls." Lake's brow furrowed. "And what do you mean by that?" Miss Marple folded her hands. Only that fruit falls when it is ripe, and this particular fruit has not yet ripened enough. Let us wait a little longer. A touch more sun, and it will drop into our hands." The inspector looked at her sharply, but she only smiled her faint apologetic smile, as though she had spoken of nothing more serious than apples in an orchard. That night Miss Marple sat by her fire, her mind turning over the day's events. She thought of Robert's restless anger, of Lydia's silence, of Kitty's frightened fall, of Colonel Arbuthnot's slip of the tongue, of Lady Phoebe's debts, of Mrs. Redpath's vanished will. Yes, the pattern was almost complete. What remained was to set the trap, gentle, polite, and inevitable. She reached for her knitting. Her fingers moved steadily, calmly, drawing the wool through the needles. But in her mind, she was weaving a very different pattern, one meant to catch not wool, but a murderer. Chapter 13. The trap is set on. Saturday afternoon, under a sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered it, Miss Marple put her plan quietly into motion. It began, as so many of her stratagems did, with something that appeared wholly innocent, an invitation to tea. The recipients were carefully chosen: Mrs. Redpath, Colonel Arbuthnot, Lady Phoebe Winterton, Mrs. Denham, Lydia Vane, and Robert Denham. Each received a small note in Miss Marple's neat hand, worded with the utmost simplicity. "I should be so glad of your company tomorrow at 4 o'clock. We might talk of poor Mr. Peterstone, who was a friend to us all in his way." None could easily refuse. To stay away would look suspicious, or worse, unkind. And Miss Marple knew that the desire to appear proper was stronger than the desire for comfort. Inspector Lake, apprised of her scheme, raised his brows. "You mean to confront them all at once?" "Oh, no, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I mean only to let them confront themselves. The truth, when reflected, often proves intolerable." The following day her little parlour was crowded, the lace cloth laid, the good cups brought out, and the sponge cake cut with the neatness of long practice. Miss Marple poured tea, offered seed cake, and appeared the very picture of an elderly lady presiding over a harmless gathering. Yet she had taken care that the large oak-framed mirror from Mrs. Redpath's villa, so admired by everyone, as she explained, was temporarily borrowed and placed against her parlour wall. "It seemed a pity not to let the village see it more conveniently," she said in her gentle way. "Such an unusual piece." Her guests murmured polite assent, though Lydia Vane went pale at the sight of the mirror, and Robert shifted uneasily in his chair. Colonel Arbuthnot scowled. Lady Phoebe fidgeted with her gloves. Mrs. Denham pressed her lips into a thin, forbidding line. Mrs. Redpath alone looked pleased, as though displaying the prize in another house were a tribute to her importance. Miss Marple poured out, passing the cups carefully. "So very dreadful, poor Mr. Peterstone, and yet I suppose not entirely surprising. A man who knew so much must inevitably carry burdens." "A dangerous man," said Colonel Arbuthnot too quickly. "Not dangerous," Mrs. Redpath corrected sharply. "Indiscreet, perhaps. He had a way of knowing things one would rather he did not." Lady Phoebe gave a little gasp. "He knew about my mortgage. He hinted that it might all come to ruin." "And what of my nephew?" Mrs. Denham demanded. "Was he not equally maligned? Why should Robert be singled out when others had far more to lose?" Robert sprang up, his face flushed. "I've told you 100 times I did not kill him, but someone here did, and we all know it." There was a sharp silence, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. In the mirror their reflections stared back at them. Strained faces, tight mouths, restless eyes. Miss Marple's voice came quietly, almost apologetically. "Yes, someone here killed him. The mirror knows. For the mirror saw what others did not." Her words fell softly, yet in the hush they rang like a bell. All eyes turned, half in fear, half in disbelief, toward the mirror's shining surface. Lady Phoebe gave a low moan and pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Mrs. Redpath sat stiff as iron, her cheeks flushed. The colonel muttered under his breath, tapping his cane. Mrs. Denham's eyes narrowed, Lydia's hands clenched in her lap, and it was then, at that precise moment, that one of them betrayed themselves, not by word but by look. A fleeting glance, sharp and terrified, darting toward the mirror as though it might indeed reveal too much. Miss Marple saw it. She had been waiting for it. She offered her guests more cake, her smile benign, but her heart told her the trap had sprung. When the company dispersed an hour later, polite but strained, Inspector Lake lingered. "Well, Miss Marple?" She folded her hands. "Oh, yes, Inspector. The truth is quite plain now. You saw it too, I think." Lake hesitated. "I saw something. A look." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "A look is often all that is needed. The guilty cannot help themselves when they fear a reflection." She lifted her knitting basket, her needles clicking as calmly as though she had been speaking of the weather. "But of course," she added, "the time for explanation is not yet. One must wait until the pattern is quite complete. Then, and only then, will the mirror give up its secret." Chapter 14. The Desperate Move. By Monday morning the atmosphere in Rosehill was taut as a drawn wire. The tea at Miss Marple's cottage had unsettled more than one person. Whispers circulated that she had seen something in the mirror, though what precisely no one could say. Mrs. Bartlett swore she had it from Miss Green that a face was revealed, though whose face she could not tell. Colonel Arbuthnot declared it all humbug, while Lady Phoebe kept to her room, pleading a sick headache. Miss Marple herself went about her ordinary routine, feeding the birds, tidying her garden, and carrying a small basket of flowers to Kitty, the maid, who was still confined to bed with her sprained ankle. Yet beneath this placid surface she was watchful. The trap had been sprung, but the creature within it would surely thrash before it was still. The thrash came sooner than expected. That evening Lydia Vane went to fetch water from the pump in Mrs. Redpath's garden. The twilight was heavy and the garden lay in shadow. She had just bent to lift the handle when she felt a movement behind her. A hand seized her arm. Another clamped over her mouth. For an instant she struggled, panic rising, until the sound of footsteps on the gravel path broke the silence. Her assailant released her and vanished into the dusk. The footsteps belonged to Miss Marple. She had chosen that very moment to drop in with a jar of jam for Mrs. Redpath. She found Lydia shaken, pale, her sleeve torn. "My dear," Miss Marple said softly, steadying her, "do not be afraid. Whoever it was, they will not try again. They know now that they are seen." Lydia gasped. "It was— oh, I cannot say. It was only a shadow." Miss Marple's eyes were kind but shrewd. "Yes, but some shadows are very distinctive if one has the patience to observe them." Inspector Lake, when he heard the account, was grim. "This is beyond all doubt. Someone in this village is desperate. They mean to silence witnesses." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes, Inspector, and desperation is the surest sign of guilt. It makes people clumsy, careless. They reveal themselves." Lake leaned forward. "You know who it is, don't you?" Her expression was very gentle. "Oh, yes. The pattern is quite plain now. The mirror showed me the truth, though not by magic. Reflections, Inspector, are often more telling than words." Lake's eyes narrowed. "Then name them." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. One must allow the guilty a little more rope. Tomorrow evening, if you will be so good as to come to my cottage, I shall explain everything. And I think our murderer will be there too. They cannot resist it." Lake stared at her. "You mean to gather them again?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, almost apologetic. "Only for tea. Murderers, Inspector, have the oddest compulsion to attend tea. They feel safer when they believe they are blending with the rest." That night, as the church clock tolled 10, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting in her lap. Her needles clicked softly, but her mind was far from wool. She thought of the frightened maid, of Robert's narrow escape, of Lydia's near assault. All of it pointed to one truth. The murderer was cornered, and tomorrow the corner would become a trap. For mirrors, Miss Marple reflected, do not lie, and neither in the end do guilty faces. Chapter 15. The Mirror Speaks. At precisely 4 o'clock the following afternoon, Miss Marple's little parlour once more held a company too large for its dimensions. The lace cloth was spread, the cups neatly aligned, the sponge cake freshly sliced, and against the wall, in its heavy oak frame, stood the mirror, its surface polished to a cold brightness that seemed almost expectant. The guests were the same as before: Mrs. Redpath, Colonel Arbuthnot, Lady Phoebe Winterton, Mrs. Denham, Lydia Vane, and Robert Denham. Inspector Lake stood discreetly near the mantel, his notebook tucked away, but his eyes keen. Miss Marple, the very picture of mild hospitality, poured tea with unhurried grace. When all were seated and the polite preliminaries exhausted, she folded her hands and looked round the room. "My dear friends," she began, "we have spoken much of poor Mr. Peterstone, whose death has so shocked our village, but I fear we have not spoken truly, for it was not sudden nor accidental, but deliberate. Mr. Peterstone was poisoned." There was a stir, a gasp from Lady Phoebe, a mutter from the Colonel, a sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Denham. Lydia sat very still, her eyes fixed upon her lap. Miss Marple went on, her tone gentle, almost apologetic. "Mr. Peterstone was a man who kept secrets. He stored them tidily, like papers in his office. But secrets are dangerous things. They can be worth money, or reputation, or freedom itself. And when such a man dies, one must ask whose secret was too valuable to remain in his keeping." She turned her gaze toward Colonel Arbuthnot. The Colonel feared exposure of family settlements. Lady Phoebe had debts she wished to hide. Mrs. Redpath's will had gone missing. Mrs. Denham wished to protect her nephew's future from unsuitable attachments. Each of you had cause to dread Mr. Peterstone's smile. The room was very still. Even the ticking of the mantel clock seemed hushed. "But cause is not enough," Miss Marple continued softly. "We must look for opportunity, for method, and above all for nature. Poison, Inspector, is a coward's weapon. It requires patience, care, and above all composure. Not a young man's recklessness, nor a girl's frightened silence. No, this was the work of someone accustomed to control, someone who could offer tea with a steady hand and smile while another drank." Her eyes, mild but unyielding, came to rest upon Mrs. Denham. The doctor's wife sat very straight, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. A flush crept slowly up her throat. "You, dear Mrs. Denham," Miss Marple said gently, "had both the opportunity and the motive. Mr. Peterstone knew of Robert's difficulties, his debts abroad, his dismissal from employment. He hinted he might reveal them, thereby ruining your careful plans for your nephew's future. You could not allow that. And so, when you served tea at the fete, you slipped poison into the cup nearest him. Only it was Mr. Peterstone who drank." There was a collective gasp. Lady Phoebe dropped her handkerchief. Robert half rose, then sat again, stunned. Mrs. Denham's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted once, only once, toward the mirror, and in its polished surface the room was reflected faithfully. The pale faces, the accusing eyes, the one woman trapped by her own composure. Inspector Lake stepped forward. "Is this true, madam?" For a long moment she did not speak. Then, in a voice tight as a drawn wire, she said, "It was for Robert's sake. I would not see him ruined." Peterstone smiled. Always smiled. He would have told. He would have destroyed him. Robert gave a strangled cry. "Aunt, no." Miss Marple rose quietly and touched his arm. "Hush, my dear. She believed she was protecting you. But protection, when it turns to murder, becomes something else entirely." Mrs. Denham's hands trembled at last. The cup in her grasp slipped, shattered against the hearthstone, and tea spread dark across the rug. Inspector Lake laid a firm hand upon her shoulder. "I must ask you to come with me." When the others had gone, the little parlour was quiet again. Miss Marple stood a moment before the mirror, looking at her own reflection. The lined face, the blue eyes, the lace cap. "Mirrors," she murmured, "never keep secrets. They only wait for us to look closely enough." She turned away, folded her knitting in her lap, and began once more the steady rhythm of her needles. Outside, the village settled into the ordinary noises of evening. Children called in, a dog barked, the church bell tolled the hour. Life in Rosehill, though altered, would go on. But for those who had seen the mirror that afternoon, there would always remain the memory of how truth, once reflected, could not be denied. Chapter 16. Aftermath. The news spread through Rosehill as swiftly as a summer storm. By the next morning everyone knew. Mrs. Denham, the doctor's dignified wife, had been arrested for the murder of Mr. Peterstone. It was almost unthinkable. She had been a pillar of the parish, organizer of fete, guardian of propriety, a woman who prided herself on order, and yet, or perhaps therefore, she had poisoned a man to keep her nephew's name clean. Some villagers shook their heads in sorrow, others in disbelief. Mrs. Bartlett declared that she had always said there was something too efficient about her. Colonel Arbuthnot pronounced that women should never be entrusted with serious matters. Lady Phoebe, pale and fluttering, spoke of roses cut down in their prime. Only Miss Green, the postmistress, summed up the general feeling with surprising simplicity. "It's always the ones you least expect," she said, "and yet once you think on it, it was bound to be her." Robert Denham bore it badly. He raged, he blamed himself, he talked of leaving Rosehill forever. But in time, as Miss Marple knew he must, his anger dulled to shame, and his shame softened into a restless resolve to begin anew elsewhere. Lydia Vane, quiet and steadfast, stood by him through the storm, her own secrets unspoken, but no longer quite so heavy. Whether they would make a life together no one could yet tell, but there was a steadiness in Lydia's gaze that suggested she might at last be free of fear. Mrs. Redpath, though shaken, quickly returned to her routines. She spoke often of how the mirror had played its part, and liked to hint with a little shiver that it had almost seemed enchanted. She never admitted that she had been more afraid of her missing Will than of any ghost. Lady Phoebe retreated once more to her roses, comforted by the thought that her foolishnesses were now buried with Peterstone. Colonel Arbuthnot blustered about his family's honour, but he was careful, Miss Marple noticed, never again to speak too sharply of his missing papers. The mirror itself was quietly removed from Mrs. Redpath's drawing-room. She claimed it was too large for the wall, though in truth the sight of it unnerved her. For some weeks it lay covered in a sheet at the back of the vicarage hall, until at last it was sold to a dealer in Marleycombe. No villager lamented its passing, yet Miss Marple knew the mirror had been nothing more than glass and wood. Its secret had never been in what it showed, but in what people betrayed when they feared it might show too much. On a quiet evening some days later, Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting. The village was settling once more into its familiar pattern, the children playing on the green, the church bell marking the hours, the faint clatter of teacups behind lace-curtained windows. Rosehill would recover. Villages always did. They whispered, they speculated, and then, like grass after rain, they grew over the bare patch where scandal had struck. But somewhere beneath the surface, the roots of human frailty remained, waiting for another season. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes resting thoughtfully on the small mirror above her mantel. It reflected her own face, ordinary, lined, kindly. Yet she knew as well as anyone that no reflection is ever quite the same as the thing it shows. "People," she murmured to herself, "are like lace. Very pretty from a distance, but look closely and you see where the threads have been knotted, or broken, or patched. The trick is knowing which thread will pull the whole piece to bits." She reached out and adjusted the antimacassar on her chair, smiling faintly. Outside, the evening air carried the sound of a blackbird's song, sweet and untroubled. Life in Rosehill, scarred though it was, had returned to its ordinary flow. But Miss Marple, who had lived long and seen much, knew that ordinary life was the most deceptive mask of all. and behind it always human nature went quietly on.